Hi, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture, The Indian Spice Trade in Search for Knowledge and Riches. Natural products, medicines, and spices from India were high-value commodities of India trade, the major commercial activity of the pre-modern world, and for centuries, the country was at the nexus of international trade by land and sea. These valuable commodities exported from the country included botanical medicines, spices, dyes, unguents for rituals and worship, and perfumes and cosmetics. Their commercial value rested on an understanding of the properties of natural products that had been formulated in the country since ancient times. Archaeological finds and political and trade documents from the beginning of the first millennium give glimpses of the complex knowledge systems of Indian botany and medicine and attest that by the Middle Ages, India trade was the backbone of the international economy. The search for shorter and more direct sea routes to the country was then the driving force behind the European voyages of discovery, and at the end of the 15th century, these voyages went on to profoundly change the map and history of the world. Arriving in the subcontinent and finding their own medical knowledge inadequate for the tropics, the Europeans required Indian traditional medical therapies and Indian physicians well acquainted with medicine. Thus, one of the most important commodities Europeans collected was regional botanical medical knowledge for use in India and their tropical colonies. For the next 250 years, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British documented medicinal, agricultural, and horticultural knowledge from scholars and practitioners in India. These European documents will be the subject of tonight's lecture by Dr. Annamma Spudich. In addition, they provide glimpses of how the encounter with culture of India expanded the European vision of the natural world and went on to inspire poets and artists. This lecture tonight is in conjunction with MAP's ongoing exhibition, Paper Gardens, Art, Botany, and Empire. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Annamma Spudich. Dr. Annamma did her PhD and postdoctoral work in molecular cell biology at Stanford University and was a biomedical researcher in academic and drug discovery settings. In 2000, she left basic science research to devote her intellectual energies to her lifelong interest in the scholar physicians of Indian traditional medicine, the history and impact of Indian knowledge in the natural sciences, and the medicine on global trade since the first millennium. Her work has brought to light important materials on the subjects that have been featured in exhibitions she curated at the Cantor Center for Visual Arts, Stanford University in 2003, the National Center for Biological Sciences in 2008 and 17, the Visvesvaraya Industrial and Technological Museum, the International Ayurveda Conference in Leiden in 2019. She is the author of several scientific papers and the catalog that accompanied the NCBS exhibition. She has lectured at universities and museums around the world. A summary of her work is featured in an online exhibition for the Google Cultural Institute. She was a visiting scholar and faculty at NCBS TIFR in Bangalore from 2005 to 2022. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Annamma for this lecture. Dr. Annamma, I think you might be on mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Share.
ask if they can see.
Yeah, can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay.
Which mode? Which mode do you see?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so shall we switch to okay, so I'm Annamma Spudich. I want to start out by explaining a little bit about how I got from experimental science into the study of Indian cultural knowledge and my introduction into this study. For that, this introductory slide, I thank the NCBS, which hosted me for almost 15 years during this work. But before that, I also had a very important encounter with the late Ashtavaidyan Chiritaman Narayana Moose, who's one of the scholar physicians of Kerala. While I was a visiting faculty at the molecular pharmacology department at the University of California, San Francisco, and we were entering upon a project to understand how biomedicine and traditional medicine was integrating in India, I had the good fortune to interact with Honorable Chiritaman Narayana Moose in Kottayam, my hometown. During my many conversations with with the scholar Moose, with the Honorable Moose, we came across discussions about assimilation of traditional Indian knowledge by Europeans. And I told him about my discovery of the papers from 1701 to 1708 in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which reported on medicines that were being collected from what was then Fort St. George, Madras, the first British colony in India, very close to the present-day Chennai. And I was very excited to let him know that many of the names mentioned in this paper from the Philosophical Transactions were in Malayalam, my native language. Well, he pointed out to me there is actually another series of documents which even precede the Philosophical Transactions papers. And he said these volumes, called the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, are in his family's archives, extended family's archives. I had never heard of the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus at that time. It was the late 1990s, maybe, and he introduced me to this tremendously important series of works. And this, of course, changed my whole trajectory. And I left University of California Molecular Pharmacology Department and decided to embark on a study to understand the assimilation of indigenous knowledge by Europeans and what was the driving force behind this knowledge transfer. In addition, I wanted to understand the knowledge treasures of Indian scholars themselves. So this is therefore dedicated to Chiritaman Narayana Moose, late Chiritaman Narayana Moose, who was a scholar physician of the classical Indian tradition. Now, the next slide sort of summarizes what I want to talk about. This is a quote from a series of books called Asia in the Making of Europe by Professor Donald Lark of the late Professor Donald Lark of the University of Chicago. He talks about the remarkable story of knowledge in his books that Europeans encountered in Asia. And he says that it is often a footnote to the imaginative daring of the European voyages of discovery. My purpose here is to illustrate that the remarkable story of knowledge was actually the driving force for the daring of European voyages of discovery. So in the next image is actually adapted from the International Dunhuang Project site, and it shows the trade routes in the early part of the first millennium. And these trade routes, of course, you realize that Asia was of course, the largest part of the known world at the period. The Americas had yet not been discovered. So you can see that all of the trade routes at some place or another actually focus on India. India is the center of the international trade routes. And the red colored routes are land routes, which of course in the 19th century was called the Silk Road. But the blue lines indicate ocean trade. And it is remarkably interesting to realize that we have documents dating from the 1st century AD, which was actually the pocketbook of a mariner dated to approximately 70 AD or Common Era, which is called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. This document has, of course, been translated, annotated into English, and is a fascinating read for anyone who is interested in this subject. So among talking about all the hazards of the voyages and many details of the ports along the voyages where the ships would stop, he talks about what made sea voyages possible and also facilitated the rapid transit from the east coast of Africa and from the Middle East to the southwest coast of India, which was discovery of the monsoon winds. So in the translation of this volume, the author of the Periplus says, if the wind called Hippolus happens to be blowing, it's possible to arrive in 40 days at the nearest mart in India, Mauritius by name. And so this made, of course, travel across the world, across the known world, or the major part of the known world, possible and facilitated in a way that many ships would travel together to avoid sea hazards. Now, do we believe all these materials? Well, this is a map that I was actually very excited to discover just a few months ago. This is part of the coin hoard of the Roman Empire study of the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford University. And the orange dots indicate the hoards of Roman coins that were discovered in continental Europe as well as in parts of Asia. And notice that most of the coin hoards, of course, Roman coins were, of course, discovered in Europe. But surprisingly, there is a focus of coin hoards that were discovered in southern part of India and Sri Lanka. So this goes along with the idea that the transit from the Mediterranean, from the coast of Africa, east coast of Africa, and was involved in trade and exchange of materials. And if anybody recently saw the reference into in the journal Economist about the Kottayam hoard, the Economist on March 26th referred to the Kottayam hoard in reference to transfer of money from one country to another. And it turns out the Kottayam hoard was the largest deposit of Roman coins discovered anywhere. And supposedly, these coins were buried in the side of a hill. What was covered then became part of a river. And this in a brass vessel, according to the definition of the period, it was discovered in 1847. And according to the description, there were 5 coolie loads, which means there were almost 8,000 gold coins. And some of these coins were actually brand new, and these coins were dated between 30 BC and 400 AD. And these were discovered in South India, which was the focus of the trade routes from the Middle East to India at the time. So let's look and see what were some of the commodities that were being traded. Well, according to the document, the Periplus and other material from the beginning of the first millennium, like Pliny the Elder and so on, we can actually put the commodities into these groups. First and foremost were spices and medicines, and dyes, mordants, and textiles. These were all derived from natural products of India, with knowledge developed over centuries by trial and error. That spices, that plant products could be medicines, spices, as well as dyes, were discovered in India before centuries by trial and error. And of course, the dyes of India were so considered to be the best ever available at the time that Saint Jerome actually has supposedly stated that wisdom is even more enduring than the dyed colors of India. The other series of materials that I was surprised to discover that was exported from India were metal mirrors, superior glass, and artificially colored stones, which were manufactured goods. And Pliny the Elder in the 1st century says, people of India, by coloring crystal, have found a way to imitate various precious stones, beryl in particular. In addition, of course, there were luxury items which were transported from India, diamonds, pearls, onyx, and tortoise shell. So this map, which is credited to Abraham Ortelius in 1597, actually refers to the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea document. And later, you can see, if you look at the map, that the west coast of India is dotted with names of cities. And these were all cities which were actually mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. So besides the tip of India, Malabar coast, there were many, many ports of trade. And as you can see in the title above, this map is made according to the details in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And so this ongoing trade, of course, was one of the major activities of international commerce during the time. And Shlomo Goetian, who is one of the a scholar in the trade with the Middle East, says that India trade was the backbone of the international economy in the Middle Ages, and medicinal substances were supremely important commodities. And these are based on papers, documents that he was able to find in the Cairo Geniza, which is a depository of a synagogue in Cairo. So his statement is based on factual information found from the Cairo Geniza that medicinal substances were the most important materials that were being traded from India to other parts of the known world at the time. We have another document which also substantiates the volume and the materials of trade from India, from southern part of India, which is called the Masuris Papyrus. It was discovered actually in the middle of the 20th century, and it's now in the Austrian National Library. And it is a trade agreement that was drawn up between two traders, foreign traders, who were living in Masuris at the time. And it's regarding a shipment of merchandise from Masuris to Alexandria in Egypt on the merchant ship called Hermaphilon. So that much detail is available in this document. The recto side of this loan agreement, which I have shown here, it actually lists the valuable merchandise that were in the ship that was being sent. And it says that contained gangetic nard, 7,478 pounds of ivory, 1,214 pounds of fabric, and so on and so forth. So it was to be conveyed to Alexandria and from there to other markets in the Middle East and beyond. And Lionel Casson from Princeton University, who has worked on this document extensively, says that with cargoes like this, recorded in this papyrus, these ships were veritable treasure ships. So this is another very important document that relates to India trade in the first millennium. And this document is, of course, dated to the 2nd century AD. So then, of course, it is important to point out that India trade brought enormous wealth to traders and attracted people from various parts of the Middle East to settle in India. And of course, Indian culture was greatly enriched by communities of foreign traders who settled in India to engage in trade. communities of Arabs, Jews, and Christians from the Middle East, and Moors from Africa, settled in various parts of India. Their cultural influences are still around. I mean, noticeable in India. You can see on the left side is a stamp that was issued in commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the Paradashi Synagogue in Cochin, which is now a World Heritage Site. On the right is the Chairman Mosque, which in Kodungalur, Kerala, and this mosque is built in the style of a Hindu temple, and supposedly the original mosque was built somewhere between 7 and 900 AD. And below is a stamp commemorating the Syrian Christian community that arrived in India from the Middle East also to engage in trade. So trade actually brought even further multicultural environment to South Indian world. So now, when we talk about medicines and herbs from India and the knowledge that was developed over centuries about the value of these products, we can actually thank the ancient knowledge systems of India, and these were really the underpinnings of India trade. And here is a quote from the Rig Veda, translated by Heinrich Zimmer. It's so veneration of herbs and their qualities were actually indigenous to Indian culture from a long, long time ago. So this quote says, "Those herbs, the firstborn of the gods, 3 ages of the world ago, those I will worship in my thoughts, and 107 virtues of those." And then there is some break in the translation. And it says then, "with whom the herbs have come together, like kingly chiefs unto the gathering, that is called a healer, a demon killer, a plague dispeller." So healer was a very important individual in Indian society. And those of us who are interested in the scientific aspects of traditional medicine, it's important to point out that knowledge of the mind-altering properties of plants were known in ancient India, because here it says the healer can be a demon killer and a dispeller of plagues. So this is a very important comment that we want to refer to later on at the end of my talk. Now, here is another very important image from the Meva Ramayana, which is now in the British Library. And this refers to, of course, the Hanuman flying to the Himalayas in search of the sacred herbs to heal wounded Lakshmana. Yes, Lakshmana. So the Hanuman's unable to identify the herb Sanjeevani, supposedly takes the whole mountain and flies to Sri Lanka. So regional stories and beliefs encode valuable information about the healing properties of plants garnered over centuries of use, and sacred groves all over India remain the last resources of many endangered medicinal plants as the environment is rapidly changing in India. Here is another very important document that records actually the traditional medical knowledge of India. And this is now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. And I must say that I had the pleasure of seeing it myself and I got goosebumps. But this manuscript is dated to between 4th and 6th century. It is written in Sanskrit. Both sides, there's 50 birch bark pages, but sheets are there. And both sides actually contain information relating to Indian knowledge systems. The first 3 volumes are specifically about medicinal properties of plants and healing rituals. And this manuscript, unfortunately, is called Bauer manuscript because of the person who actually brought it to light was an Englishman called Colonel Bauer. But it was discovered in Kuchar in Central Asia at the base of a Buddhist stupa. It was the pocketbook of an Indian Buddhist monk called Yosamitra. So Yosamitra was the author of this document. He himself was a physician. The manuscript shares prescriptions with Charaka Samhita, one of the classical texts of Indian medicine. Of course, we know that many Buddhist monks settled in various parts of Central Asia along the caravansaries for help for the people who were trading along Central Asia. And these Buddhist monks were known as great healers. In fact, the culture of the Buddhist monks, it is to heal in order to liberate others from suffering. And the document has been translated and extensively studied by A.F. Honley in 1903, and I recommend it to anyone who is interested in this very, very important document. Now, so here we have evidence so far that Indian medical knowledge was distributed all along Asia. In fact, the two of the documents that I'm not showing you is in the Dunhuang caves at the western end of China. In the caves of the Dunhuang, cave assemblies, they were able to find many documents that referred to Indian medicine. But let's look at what is happening in the European world with Indian medicines. Here is a apothecary's bill, which was taken by the book called The Merchant of Prado by Iris Origo. This is a record of, it is an apothecary's bill from a particular apothecary in Florence in 1406 to the household of Francesco Marco Dantini, who was a very important and very rich trader. It talks about pounded pepper, pounded cloves, pounded ginger, and other fine spices. And it's important to also notice that this was right after the epidemic of the plague in Europe. And the plague, on the left side of the image, is an image of the plague doctor. And the plague doctor is wearing a beak, and the beak is supposed to have been filled with Indian spices with strong scent in order to dispel, because remember, the plague was supposed to be a result of bad air. So this was a very important commodity. So Indian spices were very important commodities in the Middle Ages and beyond in Europe, because they were the most effective medicines for common ailments that were plaguing the people in Europe at the time. So then what happens is that, so we now know that India was the nexus of international trade. We know that Indian commodities were highly coveted in Europe, and materials from India were actually taken to Europe through the Middle East. They were taken mostly to the port of a great port in Alexandria in the north of Egypt. And from Alexandria, they were taken to Europe by Venetian and other European merchants, which meant that Spain and Portugal at the furthest end of the European continent was actually at the very end of receiving all these very important commodities. So in the latter part of the 15th century, Portugal and Spain decided to enter the spice trade directly. And of course, we know the story of the voyages of discovery. And of course, these were targeted towards finding a direct way to India and skipping the Middle East. And this voyage of discovery were, of course, initiated by Spain and Portugal, as I said. The Italian navigator Christopher Columbus, under the patronage of the Spanish monarchy, set out from Spain on a western route, and of course, discovered the Americas and changed the map of the world. Vasco da Gama, with the patronage of the Portuguese monarchy, went around the Cape of Good Hope, and with the help of an Arab pilot, arrived in Calicut in 1498. And da Gama's arrival in India changed the pattern of inter-Asian and Asian-European trade and the interactions henceforth. To mark this monumental event, King Manuel of Portugal commissioned 26 a panel of tapestries called the Discovery of India, the Calicut tapestries. The exotic scenes depicted in the Calicut tapestries heightened European curiosity of India. And if I were to show you some of the other panels of the Calicut series, you would be amused at the European perception of the Indian world. So here is a detail from the Calicut tapestry. This shows Vasco da Gama presenting the letter from the Samarin of Calicut to the Portuguese king. And the Portuguese king, after the return of da Gama, writes to the king of Spain saying that, and they loaded 7 ships with spices and drugs, and they also brought some jewels. Of course, the Samarin of Calicut received Vasco da Gama kindly and entered with him into a trading contract with the Portuguese. But of course, the Portuguese did not remain in the confines of the contracts, and using their superior firepower, established colonies in India. And we are going to look at the first of the colonies, which was in Goa. And this image is taken from the work of a Dutch individual who was actually living in Goa at the time. This book is also very, very interesting reading. And so this image actually shows the contemporary scene of Goa in 1579 to 1592, at the end of the 16th century. And he says, who can adequately describe the other riches and products of the city? Let antiquity no longer stand in awe of Corinth and Alexandria. It has been outstripped by the greatness and the wealth and the sublimity of the city, inhabited by people of various descents: heathens, Moors, Jews, Arabs, Armenians, Persians, Indians from the surrounding areas, and Gujarat and Deccan. But of course, Goa, of course, becomes a Portuguese colony, and Portugal, with their superior firepower, dominated trade and no longer allowed other communities from the Middle East to engage in trade. This was the beginning of the European invasion, so to speak, of India. Now, one of the most important things that the Europeans were unprepared for was the encounter with unexpected enemy, tropical diseases. So it's the same John Van Houten, Linschoten talks about the fact that they were plagued by illnesses. To quote, he says, they have many continual fevers, which are burning agues that consume men's bodies with extreme heat, whereby within 4 or 5 days they are either dead or healed. This sickness is common and very dangerous, and hath no remedy for the Portugalers, but letting of blood. But the Indians and the heathens do cure themselves with herbs. So there was great urgency to collect regional botanical medical knowledge for their use in India and also in other tropical colonies where they were facing similar fate. So within a very short time, several books were compiled by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch on Indian medical systems. During the 16th and 17th centuries, these books were compiled in rapid succession. They expanded the European knowledge of medicine behind the confines of Hippocratic medicine and influenced the study of natural history in Europe. So the first of these books, and one of the most important, was the book by Garcia Orta. He was the physician of the Portuguese viceroy, and soon after his arrival, the viceroy assigns him the task of documenting indigenous knowledge for purposes of the Portuguese use. He was a physician, studied in the prestigious University of Salamanca, and he rapidly learned Indian medical therapies from Vaidyas, Hakims, and folk healers, and even from his housemaid. He cultivated a medicinal garden, and his book lists 57 very important medicines that were available to Portuguese in India. He acknowledges in his book the inadequacy of European medicine in India, and he says, had I not been in India, I would not have been able to admit such. Garcia Orta's book was so very important to the early colonial enterprise by Europeans that the book, as I have listed here, were translated over and over again into Latin, Italian, and French, and became for the next 50 years, next 150 years, one of the major documents on Indian medicine that were used by Europeans all over the tropics. So here is a cargo that was on one Portuguese ship that was being sent out of a minor port in Kannur, which is a page taken from the paper by Caius Matthew. It's actually a very interesting paper to look at, because in addition to the products from India, actually products also from outside India, actually from the Southeast Asia, were also being collected and transported from India to Europe. And so this list of items were actually shortly after da Gama's arrival. And what happens next is that these medicines were actually being so important for ordinary life in Europe by the time that the second book that I want to bring to your attention is a book by Cristobal Acosta, who was also the physician of another Portuguese viceroy. And the book in translation, which I have done partly with the help from Dr. White, and the translation is incomplete, and it really should be completely translated for a number of reasons that I will bring up. It is called in translation, Treatise on the Drugs of Medicines of the East Indies, with illustrations of plants drawn from life. That's the other very important part of this, is that this was the first illustrated book on Indian medicines. And here on the left, I have and the book was actually meant for druggists and physicians in Europe using Indian medicines. And it contained the earliest illustrations of Indian medicines made from drawings in India. These are woodcuts. Okay, and here is an example of a folk remedy. And it's also interesting to note that Acosta says in his book that he went not only to scholar physicians, which often actually were reluctant to interact with the Europeans, but much of the information that he gathered were from folk physicians that he interacted with. And here is an example of the remedy that he recorded. And this is still in use in rural parts of India. It refers to Karagapuli, which is Kodampuli in Malayalam. And he says that this fruit is very much in use by midwives who give it to women who have just given birth to help them expel the placenta and produce milk. So it's a very effective medicine. So what is really important about Acosta's book as well is that he gives the medicinal properties of individual plants. And there are 70-some individual plants listed in this book. And as I said, it's really worth translation. Now, let's just take a quick look at this image from a frontispiece of a book in the National History Museum in Paris, which still has to be fully translated. It was originally brought to light by Kabil Raj. But in the image, you get a list of the individuals actually involved in transmitting Indian botanical medical knowledge. And of course, you see a European. Next to him is a scholar physician holding a manuscript. And of course, there is someone who is recording the images, and of course, a collector who is the woman. Now, it's important to point out that women were skilled healing practitioners in Indian society, and they almost exclusively dealt with diseases of women and children, and gynecology and childbirth. In Garcia Horta's work on Indian medicine from the 16th century, for example, Garcia Horta particularly thanks his housemaid, Antonia, for information about traditional medicines. And all over India, we know that women from all levels of Indian society were skilled healers and almost exclusively dealt with diseases of women and children. So the next work, of course, that all of you have heard of, and I understand is featured in the exhibition at MAP, is the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, published by the then governor of the Dutch colony in Kochi, Van Reed. And I'm going to quickly go through this because I understand that this is very well featured in the exhibition. The motivation for Van Reed to document this work, which took him several years, is the need for new medicines by the Dutch. But the most important thing that he states in the statement in volume 3 is that he looked at the people of Malabar and he says, they usually live to a great age and their help is cared for by native physicians who do not fetch medicaments from other regions. And they are content with only those medicaments their region supplies bountifully, a custom which is imitated with success by Europeans. So this work is an example of a productive East-West collaboration and had profound influence on European medicine and botany during the early modern period. Here is an image from the Hortus Malabaricus. Of course, the original image were not hand-colored. They're copperplate engravings. This one was obviously further hand-colored for some specific patron. But what is interesting about these images is that these were considered to be the first scientifically accurate botanical illustrations of Indian plants. Details of the plants, often with cross-sections of fruit, are drawn to scale. In this case, the extract of the leaf of the plant ummatu, which is Datura stramonium, was used for treating what they call the sacred disease, which is, of course, mental derangement conditions. And we know now, from a scientific point of view, that this plant contains hallucinogenic drugs, two alkaloids, scopolamine and atropine, which have neuroactive properties. And of course, you also know from the exhibition that you may have seen that these illustrations are absolutely double folio, stunning copperplate engravings. And of course, the name of the plant in Malayalam is listed in 4 different languages on the right, top right of every illustration. Of course, this work was pre-Linnean, so the scientific nomenclature had not come into existence at that point. But I want to point out one other thing, which I think is quite interesting, which I was able to find when I was in the British Library, which has actually the original 10 volumes of the original drawings, which were supposedly made in Malabar. And on the left is the drawing in the British Library, and on the right is the copperplate engraving of the same page. And if you look at the detail underneath, you can see that the image of the individual in the drawing is very much Indian. The copperplate engraving on the right is, of course, very European. But so this drawing suggests Indian participation in making the illustrations of the Hortus Malabaricus. Now, with all of these books became widely available in Europe, the scholarly community of Europe and universities wanted to know more about tropical medicine and tropical botany and set up botanical gardens in major universities in Europe, in Leiden, in Paris, and the Chelsea Physic Garden, and with specimens of plants imported from India to study tropical horticulture, agricultural, and medical botany. From these gardens, Indian plants and knowledge about their uses were circulated around the globe to other European colonies as well. Of course, now we come to the British East India Company, which was established in 1600 with the specific purpose of taking over trade with India. And one of the earliest establishments of the British East India Company was in Fort St. George, Madras, which is now Chennai. And the map shows that the Fort St. George was occupied by very many different colonies of people from all over the world at the time. And on the right is a bill of lading. I just want to point this out as just an aside. Bill of lading of a shipment by Elihu Yale, who was then the governor of the Fort St. George. And of course, it contains sacks of diamonds, pearls, and all the rest of the luxurious products that Yale was exporting from India. And of course, this gentleman, of course, was the founding trustee of Yale University. So we can be sure that some of the money that he made in India went into founding Yale University. This is just an aside. But here is one of the earliest documents on Indian traditional medical knowledge that was transported to Europe that I encountered when I was a graduate student. These are the 8 papers in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. The material was collected by Surgeon Samuel Brown in Fort St. George, Madras. And they were sent to the British East India Company in London and edited and published by James Petiver, who was Fellow of the Royal Society. This was very important material for the fledgling East India Company. And the motivation, of course, was for Petiver was not only to collect information for the British East India Company and to disseminate it around the world to other colonies, but also he wanted to enhance his own professional status by perhaps publishing volumes on the knowledge, botanical riches of the east of the subcontinent and complement what Van Riet had accomplished. And what is also interesting that in this book, which was in this volumes of papers, I should say, not book, he refers often to Hortus malabaricus. So many of the Malayalam names in the Hortus malabaricus actually are in the papers from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Of course, in the meantime, British are all well established in India, and the botanical gardens were set up in several parts of India for establishing a stock for disseminating such articles as may prove beneficial to Great Britain, and which ultimately may tend to the extension of the national commerce and riches. So a large number of books were published, and also material from various parts of India were collected and cultivated in the botanical gardens. And following that, I'm making it a little rapidly. I'm talking a little more rapidly because I can see I'm running out of time. So here is a selection of British documents on Indian botany and medicine. Some of them have to do with medicine. Many of them have to do with medicine and the use of pharmacopoeia, but they're also collecting information on commercial products of India, and of course, fibrous plants of India, and various subjects that relate to horticulture and botany. So of course, this large body of work were done documenting plant wealth of India for commercial and historical and horticultural purposes. And they remained valuable resources of Indian botany for us, all of us who are interested in studying materials from that period. The source of Indian knowledge recorded in these books were, of course, the Indian practitioners and scholars were, of course, not acknowledged in any of these books. The books were compiled under the names of the compilers. Now, here, this is a challenge that I want to bring to the attention of all of you in the audience. I have rapid fire gone through the historical aspects, but I want to come to present day. Now, besides historical interest, these European books on Indian regional therapies are unique resources to be revisited with contemporary scientific methods. And most plants included in the European texts are not part of the classical medical texts. For example, K.S. Manilal, who spent 30 years translating the Hortus malabaricus from Latin to English, have pointed out that only 121 of the 700 odd plants documented in the Hortus malabaricus are in the classical Ayurvedic texts. The rest of the plants and knowledge about their uses documented in the Hortus malabaricus was actually collected from folk medical knowledge of India. And also a very other important aspect of these works is that these books list medicinal properties of single plants, not complex formulation as in classical texts. And these are therefore waiting and to be available for scientific study. And here is a very important document which actually phrases this question in a very challenging way, which is that in 1954, the Indian physician scholar Rustam Vakil was given the prestigious American Lasker Award for studies on the use of reserpine in the treatment of hypertension. So Revolvia serpentina, so the statement that accompanied the Lasker Award, which says that Revolvia serpentina is an example of a block in medical communication. This drug has been used in ancient medicine of India for hundreds of years. And it goes on, and I'm skipping some of the sentences in the middle. The statement goes on to say, yet while innumerable fruitless deeds were being followed by Western medicine, this important one was overlooked until attention was finally focused on it by Dr. Vakil. Now, this plant, that the Revolvia serpentina in common parlance is a sarpaganthi. And sarpaganthi was, of course, a treatment for snake venom disease, and it is readily available from bazaars all over India. And Rustam Vakil's identification of the plant medicine of the plant, which is reserpine, which was used as a vasodilator, was also a powerful tranquilizer. And also, it turns out to be a valuable addition to psychiatric therapy. And together with a couple of other products, reserpine opened the way for an entirely new method of studying mental disorders. Interestingly, the genus Revolvia serpentina was named in honor of a 16th century German physician, Revolf, who studied plants while traveling in India with the notation of serpentina, which refers to sarpaganthi. So here is a very interesting example of an Indian medicinal, a single plant, the extract of which was brought to light the availability of very, very important material that is hidden in all of these works that I have listed. And this quote from the Lasker Award Committee is one to be taken to heart. So the challenge for us is how are we going to use these traditional knowledge systems that are recorded in all of these European works? Because the validity of their use was, of course, now established from the fact that at least 50 of the single molecule drugs that we use in everyday medicine is derived from medicinal plants. So here is the challenge for us in India. How shall we proceed to go forward to understand and use the traditional knowledge systems of India? But so having said that, I'm going to end with some fun material. This is just an addendum, an encounter of the encounter of European encounter with India and how it expanded the European vision of the natural world and inspired artists and scholars in Europe. Here are two exotic animals that were portrayed by two of the great Renaissance artists. On the left side is Albrecht Dürer's image of an Indian rhino. The rhino was actually sent to the Portuguese king by the Sultan of Gujarat. And of course, the rhino became, of course, a celebrated animal in Europe at the time. And so someone sketched the rhino and sent an image to Albert Dürer. And Dürer created this somewhat fantastic image of the rhino as if he is wearing shields and so on. But on the other hand, this was a very important image that established the interest in natural history, tropical natural history in Europe. On the right side is an image of an Indian elephant from Kochi. And it was, this is a pen and ink sketch by the School of Raphael, attributed maybe to Raphael, which is in the museum in Berlin. And he and his Indian mahout are portrayed. And because the Portuguese king had sent the elephant to Pope Leo X, who was fascinated by this creature and kept him as a special pet under his favorite, in his favorite menagerie. And the Pope became so fascinated by this animal that actually Raphael not only sketched this animal, but of course, this image of both the rhino and the elephant appears again and again in other Renaissance artworks. That's sort of an interesting aside. The other is that, of course, poets and writers of the period were also fascinated by knowledge about India. And the most dominant one that comes to mind is, of course, John Milton. John Milton, in his book, in his poem, epic poems, Paradise Lost, talks about Adam and Eve being banished from Eden. So the quote is, into the woods where soon they chose the fig tree, not that kind of fruit renowned, but such as to this day to Indians known in Malabar or Deccan spread surrounds. So he imagines that the Indian tree of the fig tree is actually the tree of Malabar, no, tree of paradise. This is, of course, aluminum, which you encounter in many many temples in India. And of course, he goes on to, of course, portray the paradise to Adam, like the Agra and Lahore of the great Mughal. So the imagination of Europeans were fired by the exposure to knowledge about India. And of course, William Shakespeare also has many, many references in all of his works. And here, of course, in Merchant of Venice, he talks about the argosy bound to Tripoli and another to the Indies. And then, of course, would scatter all her spices. So references are prolific in many, many important works during that period. So it is a very important information to realize that the influence of encounter with India was profound, not only in the botanical medical sciences, and of course in literature and art of the period. And I can give you many more examples, except that I'm running out of time. So at last, thank you for listening. And anybody who is interested in additional information, please feel free to photograph this slide. Some of this material is covered in the Google Cultural Institute exhibition, which is online, and some of the earlier material about the early books, Hortus Malabaricus, and also Garcia Orta's work and Acosta's, is covered in the small catalog of the first exhibition I curated at the NCBS in 2008. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Annamma, for such a fascinating lecture. We'll now open to a Q&A. I can begin by reading the questions in the chat. Shall I get started, Dr. Annamma?
I'm sorry?
Shall I get started with the questions?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yes, okay. So the first one is there a meaningful difference in how the Portuguese, Dutch, and British approached this knowledge extraction or documentation? For instance, did later colonial powers learn from them or build on what the earlier ones had done?
You're asking me, how do we know, what do we know about how the knowledge was assimilated? Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Yes.
How
Okay.
did newer colonial powers build on this or use that knowledge? Yeah.
Yes, I think that Garcia Orta actually talks about in great detail about how the information was collected. He interacted with physicians, Ayurvedic physicians, Konkan scholars, and folk medical practitioners. And he actually had a very open attitude towards learning indigenous medicine, because he says in his works that soon after he arrives, he realized that Galenic medicine is not applicable in India. So Garcia, and the same is true of Cristobal Acosta. Acosta actually was commissioned by his viceroy, and he goes with a translator, interpreter, and talks to medicinal, knowledge goes from village to village collecting medicinal knowledge. And most people receive him actually openly and are very eager and open to share the knowledge. And of course, how Hortus Malabaricus was assembled is detailed in volume 3 of the Hortus Malabaricus. And we know that four of the main scholars that provided the information for Hortus Malabaricus are credited in the Hortus Malabaricus by written testimonial in their own hand, which is engraved in the volumes. And the main scholar was, of course, an Irava physician, Itti Achudan. He's credited with a full page acknowledgement written in Old Malayalam in his hand. So in those days, in that period, the collaboration between the two were actually very equal. And of course, again, the Hortus Malabaricus, of course, goes to, in volume 3, Van Reed goes into great extent to talk about the collaborative work. And he also thanks the collectors, the people who identified the plants. And of course, the image that I showed earlier suggests that even the drawings were probably made by Indian artists. But later on, of course, the British interaction with the Indian physicians were not always as friendly. And of course, as I pointed out, there were no credits given to any of the individuals who provided the knowledge in the later works that are published by the British East India Company. But if you are asking me, was there coercion? There is no evidence.
Thank you, Dr. Annamma. That was actually going to be my next question. In terms of thinking about how did Garcia, for example, or Van Reed navigate these relationships? And can you tell us a little bit, you spoke about the documentation of this in rich detail. Can you tell us a little bit about how they went about that?
Well, but from Garcia Water, I mean, I can tell you, of course, much more about how the Hortus Malabaricus was assembled, because Van Reed in volume 3 gives us detailed information. And he he assembled with the help of the Kochi Raja scholars. The 3 Ayurvedic scholars were obviously brought to his attention by the Kochi Raja. And Itti Achyutan, exactly how he came to Van Reed's attention is unclear. But Itti Achyutan was a very famous Yerava physician. And he came from a lineage of Yerava physicians. And I think that Van Reed was very polite, agreeable, and basically he was, seeker of knowledge, and he made it very, very plain. So the interaction was, of course, very, very friendly. And he says in one of his volumes, he says that these scholars have no other occupation but temple worship and the study of natural sciences. So he speaks of them with great respect. In fact, that particular passage is engraved in the window of the NCBS reception hall, that he says that these scholars are, have no worldly cares. They're engaged in temple service and also the study of natural sciences. So there is an enormous amount of respect. When it comes to the later works by the British, for example, in some of the works that were collected by from Fort St. George, Madras, there is also a statement from Samuel Brown that he was interacting very pleasantly, very equally with Indian physicians, because in the early days for British in India, and it is very clear that they needed the help of Indian physicians. But later on, British works, we have no clue about how the knowledge was assembled, how the knowledge was collected, because they don't talk about it. So early on, there was much more equal interaction between Europeans and scholars, because they were supplicants, basically. Like you read in the statement, it says, they were dying left and right, and people around them were healthy. So they needed to understand.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question. So someone has asked, thinking about the contemporary politics of indigenous knowledge, biopiracy is considered a big thing. Do corporations scrutinize these colonial records for biopiracy, or do you read this history in your work? Sorry.
Are you talking about corporations using this indigenous knowledge for biopiracy? I didn't understand the last part of the question.
I can just read it again. Do corporations scrutinize these colonial records for biopiracy? And do you read this history in your work? Is this something you have
No,
also
No, I have not looked at biopiracy, but on the other hand, there is now an international agreement, which actually Professor Manilal extensively has written about, which says that if it can be established that a plant medicine was derived from indigenous knowledge, and that we can prove with a record, no company is allowed to develop and patent a medicine that's derived from indigenous knowledge. That is part of an international agreement. In fact, I have heard of a story of a company in Florida, which was started by two Indian physicians who actually worked out a method for a particular disease, a cure, which were not allowed to be patented because it was derived from traditional Indian knowledge. So there is an international agreement, and I forget the initial. There is a biopiracy agreement that does prevent people from using indigenous knowledge. Of course, we in India can, but not outside of India.
Thank you. The next question is, could you tell us a little bit about contemporary, sorry, that's a very similar question. I'm going to move on to another one. Could you tell us a little bit if the family of Viden Moose and the making of the Hortus Malabaricus? Could you delve a little bit into the details of that?
Details of the Vaidya family?
Yeah.
Well, Olasya Moose was an Ashtavadyan. Ashtavedya tradition is particular to Kerala. Ashtavadyas are scholar physicians who were trained in the traditional Gurukulam way, which meant that the oldest son of the family of an Ashtavadya, and there were 18 Ashtavadya families in Kerala, and they were designated as physicians in 8 different categories of diseases, pediatrics, and so on and so forth, okay? And mostly they did not mostly treat diseases of gynecology and those matters, because all of the Ashtavadyas by tradition are men, okay? So what happens is that in a family of Ashtavadyas, the oldest son is designated to become the next Ashtavadya. And their training starts at the age of 4 with a ceremony called Ezhuthirthu. Ezhuthirthu means that it's literally translated into sitting to writing. So the pujari comes and the boy is seated on a platform, and pujari guides his hand to write the letter A, the beginning of the Malayalam alphabet. And from there on, then at the age of 7, there is a sacred thread ceremony, which of course designates him as the next candidate for the study of the classical texts. And by the age of 12 to 13, these individuals are then sent either to study with their own family Ashtavadya or with someone else. And they live and study with this scholar physician for the next maybe 10 years. And they first of all learn Sanskrit and all the Sanskrit texts. And then they learn recitation of Sanskrit texts. And then they, of course, learn all of the Sanskrit texts that relate to medical practice. In fact, my teacher, Honorable Moose, said to me, recitation is very important, because he said that, there is a word called muhutram. Muhutram means a special moment. And he said if it is spoken the wrong way, it can become mutram, which means urine. So he said recitation, learning to recite the classical text is very, very important. So after this series of training years, the scholar physician then allows his student to start practicing in his presence. He is asked to identify a disease, and then he is asked to prescribe the treatment. In addition, they have to become familiar with all the medicinal plants because most Ashtavedya families had their own medicinal gardens. They also had to learn preparations of medicines. And this training, of course, and then lastly, they spend recording in hand what they are, one of the classical texts. For example, so that is to learn, make sure they have learned the text correctly. So this is a lifelong dedication of almost 15, 20 years, perhaps, to learn to be an Ashtavedya. Unfortunately, the Ashtavedya tradition is no longer in practice because four-year Ayurvedic colleges have replaced the Ashtavedya tradition. And of course, what the current learning is condensed version of these texts. And it's actually a fascinating story. In fact, I'm actually interested in writing about the Ashtavedya tradition because the 3 or 4 years that I spent with also Narayanan Moose gave me an understanding of the scholarship and the dedication of this type of medical practice, which is really something that is being lost in India because they're no longer, Ashtavedyas are no longer allowed to practice without having gone to four-year Ayurveda medical college.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Annamma. I think that's all the questions that we've had received so far today. But thank you once again for such an insightful lecture. And we are very much looking forward to your upcoming research as well. I would also like to thank the ISL interpreters for today, Dr. Renuka and Atul. Thanks so much for interpreting the session, and thank you to everyone also for joining for this lecture. If you haven't got the chance to see the exhibition Paper Gardens, Art, Botany and Empire at MAP so far, I really hope you have some time to check it out. It's on until July 5th.
Well, thank you for including me in this. I'm really very glad to have the opportunity. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good.